right, well, thanks for joining us this morning. Again, this is Marguerite Reese from the California Department of Education. Unfortunately, I wish we weren't here today, but we are here to help. As you know, there were severe wildfires in primarily Northern California in October of this year, and then wildfires primarily in Southern California in December of this year. And when the wildfires took place in October in Northern California, the U.S. Department of Education reached out to the California Department of Education to offer their assistance, and particularly to let us know about a grant called Project SERV. And I'll go more into these details today, but this webinar is targeted for the folks in Southern California that were impacted by the December fires. So we'll just go ahead and get started. If at any point you have questions, feel free to type them into the chat box. I'll also open it up at the end if you have any questions, and hopefully we can get those answered for you today. I imagine this webinar will take 10-15 minutes. It's a pretty quick one, and I also include my contact information, and these slides should be posted to our website tomorrow, so you can download them as well. Oh, we're having a little trouble advancing the slides. Give me one moment, and we'll get started. All right, so this is information on our website related to hopefully that's helpful for you for this information, and as you begin to recover from the impact of the wildfires. Of course, as I mentioned, we'll have the slides from today's webinar, and they should be posted tomorrow. They're not available at this moment. And then there's also a document that you're going to need, and it is the Project SERV application. It's also known as the LEA Needs Assessment. And I'll show you an example later on, but we intentionally tried to create it as a very simple one-page document for school districts to fill out. So that is a link to the resources page, as well as the application to the Project SERV grant, also known as the Needs Assessment. Okay, so this is a slide that we used in the October wildfires in response, because initially, just because there were so many counties involved and so much immediate need, and I guess fortunately it has been such a long time since schools had been in sort of the danger zone and in evacuation areas for an emergency, that we reminded folks of how school districts or LEAs can interact with state resources, and particularly those are through Cal OES, or the Governor's Office of Emergency Services, Cal OES. And so it sounds like, particularly in Santa Barbara County and Ventura counties and others that have been impacted, you do have regular communication with your county EOC or your Emergency Operations Center. That is the hub. That is where school districts need to be involved. As we're working with the folks in Santa Barbara County who have been impacted by the mudslides this month, it's been reassuring to see what a strong connection there is between the County Office of Education, the local school districts, and then the County Emergency Operations Center. And so if your LEA has a really specific need that cannot immediately be met, we suggest and encourage you to work closely with your county EOC to report that need. The county EOC will do its best with available resources to address that need. If for some reason it cannot be met with available resources, the county EOC submits a request to Cal OES. And then as needed, Cal OES creates something called a mission task and then coordinates with the various state and federal agencies to provide resources back to that county. The resources are then provided, as you'll see in that dark blue circle, or square, rectangle, and then hopefully the LEA needs are met. So if you have a large need or something that just can't be tackled locally, please, please, please begin to communicate with your county EOC. Okay, so Project SERV is an acronym for the School Emergency Response to Violence, and it's a grant dedicated federal funding used to provide education-related services to LEAs in which the learning environment was disrupted due to a traumatic crisis. And so typically, actually, this is an atypical grant that we're doing, and I'll explain that in just a minute. Typically, it's a grant awarded to an LEA or on a school level basis. After the October wildfires, as I mentioned, the U.S. Department of Education reached out to CDE and provided the opportunity to apply for a larger grant or a larger amount of funding as the state educational agency on behalf of those impacted LEAs. And so the CDE is indeed applying for a Project SERV grant on behalf of the October impacted LEAs. And given the events in Southern California, there will be a separate Project SERV application for the December impact. So CDE will have 2 Project SERV applications. We are still in the process of determining with the U.S. Department of Education if there will be a third grant for those counties or LEAs impacted by the mudslides in Santa Barbara County. If I had to bet $1, I would say that we will likely couple that application with our December wildfire application, but we will provide that update to our website. For example, Project SERV grants were distributed in this way to New York after Hurricane Sandy and to the state of Louisiana after their hurricanes and subsequent flooding in 2016. So the application process, we hope, is as straightforward as possible. And this is a relatively unique federal grant because it is flexible and fluid by design, because the U.S. Department of Education knows that each disaster, incident, emergency comes with its unique needs circumstances. And so the way it will work is LEAs will need to complete that one-page form, the needs assessment I linked to earlier, and it's also available here, by the end of February. Initially, we had reported that date to be January 31st, but we received some feedback that school districts just needed more time, and so we are happy to provide more time as needed, and so we pushed back that due date for this December application until the end of February. So our website will be updated accordingly, but feel free to tell your colleagues who also will be applying for this grant that you have more time and we need those needs assessments back to CDE by the end of February. And so the process will be that LEAs complete those applications, submit them to CDE, and then the CDE reviews those needs assessments for allowable expenses. In just a moment, I'll go through some examples of allowable and unallowable expenses. We may at that point call your school district and ask for additional information just based on how you described the needs assessment. We want to keep the application as simple as possible, but we may call you and just ask for some additional justification. And then we send those needs assessments that we've sort of edited for allowable expenses to the U.S. Department of Education, and then they review them as well for what they deem to be allowable expenses. I know it may be somewhat frustrating that there isn't a black and white list of this expense is allowable and this one is unallowable, but as I mentioned, this grant is flexible by design, and so the U.S. Department of Education didn't want to publish or create a list of a hard and fast rules of things that can and cannot be reimbursable under this grant. So my advice to you as folks filling out this application is err on the side of listing everything that you think may be eligible for this grant. It won't hurt your application in any way. We will review the grant, and if we think that something, or the U.S. Department of Education thinks it is an unallowable expense, we just will remove it from your application. We will send you a note letting you know that it was removed, so you can use that information for your own planning. So at that point, the U.S. Department of Education, once they receive the information from CDE, makes a funding determination based on the LEA Needs Assessment. We have not fully submitted our October application, so we don't know how much funding we will receive. In talking with other states, in fact, I think all states, when they've applied, their ask has been greater than what their grant award has been. And so I feel very confident that California will receive funding for both the October and December incidents, but it likely will not be 100% of our ask. And so I'm just making this up. If California's ask is $2 million and we only receive $1 million in funding from the U.S. Department of Education, the CD will have to make a determination of how we will fund those needs assessments and those requests based on the funding we do receive. And so that information will be detailed in your subsequent award letter. And so once you receive those letters from CDE and funding has been approved, LEAs may submit reimbursement requests to the CDE. for reimbursement. I'll go into that a little more detail in future slides. And so this is a image of what the needs assessment form looks like. And so again, hopefully it's pretty simple. Just list your LEA name, contact information, a description of the item, a justification of the need, an estimate of the number of students that will benefit. If you're aware of any other funding sources that may pay for this, and so in most incidences, we believe that the FEMA Public Assistance Program and or private insurance will likely cover many, if not most, of your expenses. But we also know that both paths, FEMA and private insurance, will take some time. First, for the district to analyze what your need is, to submit claims through both of those processes and others that may be available. And so you may not know exactly what your ask is at this point, so approximations are okay at this point because, for example, let's say that you request $5,000 as an allowable expense for additional substitute teachers. But in the end, you only use $4,000 worth of substitute time. And so because you're submitting reimbursements to CDE, you would only submit the $4,000 claim to CDE, and so you would only be reimbursed for those actual expenses. So I think that goes through that. Let's move on to the next slide. All right, so funds are intended to provide education-related services to LEAs in which the learning environment was disrupted due to a traumatic crisis. All costs must be in addition to costs that LEAs would have incurred in the absence of the December 27 wildfires. So the example I gave of substitute teachers, I imagine in most school districts you have sort of a regular cost built in for substitute teachers. Again, just making up numbers, but for your school districts, if you typically have 5 substitute teachers a day, you would need to subtract those 5 substitute teachers a day from your request to the CD. So let's say at the peak of the wildfires you needed 12 substitute teachers a day, then your request through this application would only be for 7 substitute teachers because you would need to include sort of your regular substitute allocation. So here are some examples of allowable expenses. They have to be directly related to the December 27 wildfires. They are considered necessary to restore the learning environment, and as I mentioned before, cannot be funded by any other recovery, funding, or insurance reimbursement. So here are some examples. Targeted mental health assessments, referrals, and services. If you brought on temporary crisis counselors on site or provided other services, that theoretically is a reimbursable expense. Overtime for teachers, counselors, law enforcement, security officers, and other staff. In our October SERV application, we certainly and understandably had many school districts, note that, for example, they had additional custodial staff time, but they didn't designate that it was overtime, and so it's important to specify, particularly for staff time, that this was time above and beyond their regular duties because, of course, you would normally, without the incident of the fires, need to support your custodial staff, but let's say that staff worked overtime to restore school to its learning environment so school could reopen, you would want to note the difference and only ask for reimbursement for that extra time for the overtime. Again, substitute teachers could be an allowable expense. Labor costs needed to repair the learning environment. In most cases, this is additional staff time. Costs to transport students to and from temporary facilities or temporary housing. Cost to operate a school in an alternative site. So if you need to lease additional portables or classroom space, this also is theoretically allowable under this grant. And as I mentioned, there isn't an exhaustive list of these allowable expenses, so I would suggest that you err on the side of listing anything you think may be allowable, and we will go through both the California Department of Education and the U.S. Department of Education and make a determination. And costs may be considered if they were incurred on or after the date that the incident began, starting in December 2017. So for some school districts, they've needed to lease temporary space certainly throughout the rest of the school year and maybe into the next school year. One thing I will mention is that, and it's not clear on the needs assessment, and we'll find a way to rectify this, but the Project SERV that CDE will receive and subsequently pass on to the school districts is for 1 year. And so let's say theoretically that we are funded on March 1st of 2018. Probably won't happen that quickly, but let's say that California is funded on March 1st. The grant then will be for 12 months after March 1st. So claims can be from essentially March 1st of 2018 through February, I guess, 28th of 2019, but costs can also go back to the date of the incident. So really, costs can be from, in my example, the date of the incident from December 2017 all the way through, theoretically, February 28th of 2019. I hope that makes sense. Once you submit a needs assessment and we work with you to determine what costs are, we can sort of prorate what the cost would be for those sort of more long-term expenses. All right, so here are some examples of things that are not considered allowable under Project SERV. So purchases of permanent value, or as a few folks have referred to, the stuff. So computers, supplies, textbooks, buses. You can certainly rent a van or a bus, but you cannot buy the bus or van. In the Sonoma County fires, we learned, of course, that many students and teachers lost their homes. And of course, as part of that, their textbooks may have been in their home during the fire. Unfortunately, textbooks are not something that can be considered reimbursable under this grant. Any construction-related costs cannot be included. And then a big one, particularly for Northern California, unfortunately, that cannot be considered are things such as air quality testing, soot and smoke removal or abatement, the cost for air filters, face masks. And the reason particularly for these last two bullets is because these are expenses certainly that we know that school districts likely incurred after a fire, but we believe should be covered either by private insurance or the FEMA Public Assistance Program, which is why they are not allowable through this grant. Again, claims recoverable under your private insurance, including any Medicaid or Medi-Cal reimbursements, any services normally provided by the LEA, and any activity for which other recovery or insurance funds are available. So here's an example that we actually borrowed from the state of Louisiana. They've been great partners with us in thinking through how California would set up our grant application because, of course, they went through this in a big way in 2016. So you'll see how they filled it out in the first line. Reimbursements for substitutes needed to replace displaced teachers. They talked about how this one particular school district had more than 100 staff displaced from their personal homes. They talked about the number of students that would be benefited. They didn't believe that there were any other sources of funding for this reimbursement. They guessed through a cost, and then they listed the length of time they thought they would need funding for this reimbursement. And then also at the bottom, they listed overtime costs associated with the flood. One thing that probably would have been helpful in this final line is to detail a little further overtime costs for what? Custodial staff, school administrative staff, communications staff, whatever is applicable, but to detail a little further who those people were and for what duration of time. Because that is likely one that I will call your school district back and say, can you just provide me a little more information, like a breakdown? And again, it's a very informal process, which I know feels funny to a lot of us, because often federal grants are typically very restrictive and, have certain requirements, and this one just feels a little different, but that's by design. And here's another example of from Louisiana, but school districts leasing temporary space and then leasing school buses to resume somewhat of normal activity for their school district. And so it's also worth noting, and I think this will be important, particularly for a few districts or a few counties in Southern California where there's a high concentration of impacted private schools. School districts receiving funds under Project SERV must provide for equitable participation by private school students and teachers, including engaging in timely and meaningful consultation with appropriate private school officials. This is much like the private school consultation requirement of Title I. And so it's very important to include the private school community as you decide to create your needs assessment and submit your application. So as I mentioned, it's similar to the Title I requirement, and the purpose of the consultation is to assess needs and provide services from the resources allocated by the grant. The way it will work if your LEA applies on behalf of a private school is, and this is an oversimplification, but the private school will essentially be treated for the purposes of this grant like an additional school within your LEA. And so, I'm just making this up, let's say your school district receives $100,000 based on your needs assessment, and the private school was $25,000 of that application. CDE will fund or allow for allowable expenses to your school district up for $100,000. But those claims from the private school have to be funneled through the local LEA. And so the private school cannot claim directly to the California Department of Education for those reimbursements. A local agreement of some kind is going to have to be struck between the local LEA and the private school for the funds to flow first from the U.S. Department of Education to CDE, and then most importantly from CDE to the local educational agency, and then from the LEA to the private school. If anyone has more specific questions about that, feel free to contact me directly, and we can talk through that at greater length. So here's my contact information where you can get in touch with me at any time about this grant. Happy to answer any questions. I hope that the additional time provided allows folks to sort of collect all of their needs. I know it's just been a hectic and unusual time for all of us. And if there are ways the CDE can be generally supportive, this email address is really important, the emergency services at cde.ca.gov. Many staff throughout our building check this account multiple times a day. So for example, I sit in our government affairs division and I check this account regularly, but staff from our school facilities office check it, our nutrition office checks it, special education, our school fiscal office, which processes those J13 waivers if you're trying to recoup some of your allocations for your ADA. We all check that account, so hopefully it's meant to be a one-stop shop for your disaster or emergency-related questions to go to one place, and then the appropriate contact person at CDE will respond to those inquiries. So just a couple housekeeping things. We will post this slide, the slide deck sometime tomorrow or later this week. You can contact me at this emergency services address anytime. Feel free to call me. That's my direct line at my desk. And please help us spread the word that the due date has been pushed back until the end of February, until February 28th. So I see no questions. I'll wait just a moment to see if anyone wants to type those questions into the Q&A box. But other than that, we will conclude the webinar for today. Thanks so much for joining. All right, well, hearing no questions, we will end the webinar. And again, feel free to contact me at any time. Thank you for your time this morning. Bye-bye.